Hello, you're about to listen to a radio program provided by the Limestone Church of Christ, located in Kingston, Ontario. Please feel free to check us out on the web at lookinguntojesus.net.
Hello and welcome to today's program. My name is Tom Rainwater, and I'm pleased to have with me today Dr. Don Patton, who is a geologist from the Dallas area, and he's here to talk about creation versus evolution. And this is the third program in a series of 3 with Dr. Patton, and it's great to have you back.
Thank you, sir. Good to be here.
Today, for our last program together, I want to talk about the fossil record. Now, when fossils of animals and humans are found, what do they indicate? Do they fit the theory of evolution or the creation model?
Well, I think a lot of Christians are intimidated by the fossil record. They think they belong to the evolutionists. I think the absolute opposite is true. They are strongly in favor of and support the concept of creation and oppose, and I think just virtually falsify the concept of evolution. However, all of the evidence is not being presented in the textbooks, and that's one of the things we try to do when we lecture on the college campuses. When you look at the fossil record, you see this fossil here, that fossil there. How do you discern whether it's indicating evolution or creation? Well, typically they base it on similarities and assume that similarities indicate kinship, and this is the way they line them up. And so when you talk about fossils, you have to start by talking about similarities, because otherwise they're just dead things and rocks. That's the only way they mean something, is by looking at similarities. However, when you think about it, similarities don't necessarily indicate kinship. Now, sometimes they'll argue, well, you look at cousins and brothers and sisters and you see that they look similar. Yes, that's absolutely true. But at the same time, we know that there are other explanations for it, too. You drive down a street, for example, in a subdivision, you see houses that look similar, and that's not because they're cousins, but because they had a common designer. And we readily understand that. Now, if you have a common designer, you would expect similar forms for similar functions. When we have great music pieces, symphonies with a theme and then variations on that theme, we don't imagine that that just happened all by itself, but a composer composed that. So we have expectations of similarities, and as we think about the fact that, yes, the evolutionist would predict there would be similarities in the fossil record, we would too. There are different types of similarities that would be predicted. The evolutionist would indicate that there's this branching, connecting pattern of similarities, like nesting tables, whereas the creationist would say it would be more like a mosaic, where the designer would use a blue tile over here where he needed it, and a blue tile over there, and the blue tiles are similar, but they're not connected and branching as a natural progression pattern would indicate. So both of us would predict similarities, but a different pattern. When we look at the fossil record, we see similarities. We look at the ape and the man, and we see very obvious similarities, especially in the structure of the skeleton. And when we look at the blood, for example, we see blood serum actually can be interchanged in some instances, and very obvious similarities. And so we can both explain common designer or common genetics, but as we look further, I think we see that this is obviously a mosaic pattern. You look at the ape, for example, yes, blood serum is similar, but in milk chemistry, the donkey is much more similar to human milk than is the chimpanzee milk, for example, or the ape milk. When you look at blood antigen A, our closest relative is the butterbean. We're all concerned about cholesterol. We see that in the garter snake. And we have brain hormone that is just an extremely complex protein, and exactly the same thing in a cockroach. The lysosome that we have in our eyes to combat bacteria. Now, here's something that where we need protection from bacteria. Well, the hen needs that in the egg to protect that from bacteria. Same complex chemical in the chicken. But we don't see these connected. We just see them as the mosaic. But if you just pick certain similarities, you can line them up, ignoring other similarities, and with your purposed, planned presentation, you can line them up to make them look like whatever you want it to look like. But that's not science. When we think about the nature of the fossil record, we need to keep in mind that we're not involved in interpreting this as an empirical scientist. Empirical science involves observation and reproduction, experimentation. With fossils, we're dealing with historical phenomena. Mm-hmm. That's the historical part of geology. And when you're trying to reconstruct history, you can't reproduce it, literally. You can't experiment. You can't reenact it. You can't watch it happen again, as you do with normal experiments. Mm-hmm. And so this is circumstantial by nature and is never used as proof if we understand the nature of the evidence. Now, if you're going to prove evolution, the fossil record is the only documentary evidence that would show what happened in the past, and yet that evidence by nature does not produce proof empirically. It's historical and circumstantial, and we often forget that.
So the fossils are historical evidence simply because when a fossil is found, we see what's been left behind.
Yeah, and you study historical geology, where it's like studying the history of England. Now, you can't prove by reproduction, by experimentation, what happened 1,000 years ago. You've got some indications of it, you get pretty good records, but it's circumstantial evidence, not that which proves empirically. And that's the nature of the best evidence for evolution. Now, it could be good evidence, but when we look at the two concepts of creation and evolution in terms of the fossil record, one of the ways to proceed, in a way that we do often in science, is to make predictions. And they're very obvious and very opposite predictions made by the two models. The creation model would predict an abrupt and complex and diverse beginning. They would be separate, they would be complex right from the start. Whereas the evolutionist would predict very simple beginnings and gradually branching, connected similarities as he progressed forward. And then as you go on up the record, you would see similarities. Creationist would predict separate mosaic-type similarities, whereas the evolutionist would predict the branching connections. Well, those contrasting predictions should allow us to look at the fossil record and see which model fits best. And when we allow the evolutionist to describe the nature of it, invariably, it's just as if we made up the story. You've got separate, distinct kinds right from the start, and more kinds, more major phyla than we have now. And they're complex right from the start.
Okay, so the evolutionist, to fit his theory, he would have to find in the lowest layers the most basic forms of life instead of that which is complex. But we find the opposite, right?
In the first layer with multicellular life, that's the Cambrian. That's where the fossil record of life really begins. You've got some blue-green algae below that, simple forms. That's a part of our model that fits as well with ours as theirs. But the idea of this Cambrian explosion is the typical way that's described. At the bottom of the lowest layer is not what the evolutionists would predict at all. And when you look at the critters that were in there, they're by no means simple. I think they lived at the bottom of the ocean, and we're looking at a flood deposit from the bottom of the ocean. But the animals that are there are complex, and we find vertebrates there. We find forms of fish. Most people don't know they're fish in the Cambrian. Those are vertebrates. That's the highest order, the chordates, the same general phylum that we're in. Trilobites are probably the most common critter that you find there in the Cambrian. These were kind of like little roly-poly bugs that lived on the bottom of the ocean. But they're very, very complex. You've got a differentiated head and thorax, the middle section, and tail. You've got a complex respiratory system and nervous system. You've got eyes that are probably the most complex eyes in the living world. Compound, just spectacular. In fact, some of them are so well preserved you can still take pictures through the lenses of these trilobite eyes, and they corrected for chromatic aberration. In fact, some physicists have said they look like they were designed by physicists and a modern physicist. And that's what you find at the bottom. That's the way it starts when you see the multicellular animals in the Cambrian.
So it starts with complexity then.
It starts with complexity, and you find the most elaborate forms of the trilobites at the lowest part of the Cambrian layer. So I think you just see a refutation right from the start. You have trees in the Cambrian. Now you read the textbooks describing the Cambrian, this lowest layer, nothing but shallow seas everywhere. Well, if you've got 6 genera of trees, which we've now found, obviously you got trees somewhere. Now, we don't find them growing in place, but you find parts of trees, and you find pollen, and you find pieces of bark. And you can identify these species of trees, and we've got them from all over the place, as well as the various representatives of the chordates, the Cambrian, and that's what you find at the bottom. Now, the most critical part of the record for the distinguishing between these two ideas would be the beginning, and what you find are trilobites and trees, more major phyla than we have in the living world today, right from the start, and that's just the way it begins. Now, again, I couldn't have written the story any better if I were trying to make it up.
So for the evolutionists, trees shouldn't be in that. Trees came later.
Yes, as well as fish, animals with backbones, and critters with eyes like trilobites that are superior to ours in some ways. Mm-hmm. In fact, on the website www.bible.ca/tracks, dealing with the fossil record, you can see the quotes from the evolutionists that will document the points that we're making. And you can look up in the secular literature the description of the trilobite eyes and the fish and trees in the Cambrian that certainly should not be there. The sudden and the complex beginning is well documented by the leading evolutionist.
Mm-hmm. Well, what did Darwin think about the fossil record?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because most people think that that's what convinced him, which is not the case at all. Now, Darwin talked about the fossil record, and he said there ought to be this graduated continuum, this gradual change from one to the other with transitional forms between the major kinds. But he acknowledged that's not what you find. He says geology does not provide these, and then said that this is probably the strongest argument that could be made against his theory. This was the biggest problem Darwin had, the fossil record. However, he predicted that those gaps would be filled in. Now, this was a matter of faith, and he predicted. Well, the prediction failed, because the more we saw, the more obvious and more defined and clearer those gaps became. In fact, David Rapp, who is curator of vertebrate paleontology at the American Museum of Natural History, commented on Darwin's statement, and he said the prediction failed. It's gotten worse instead of better, and we have fewer examples of transitional forms than we have today. So the leading experts will tell you it was Darwin's worst problem, and it's worse now than it was then.
Yeah, and he admitted it too.
Absolutely.
And he just hoped that it would be found in the future, and
right.
never has been.
And of course, you've read all about this in your biology textbooks, right?
I don't think it's there.
No, they leave that part out. But almost like the Bible, a lot of people talk about it but don't read it. They need to read Darwin and they'd see some of the problems like this.
Well, did Darwin really say that man came from apes?
This is the November 2004 issue of National Geographic. The editorial starts out saying, Darwin never made this claim. That's mind-boggling. How could the editor of National Geographic make such a statement? That is exactly what Darwin said. Now, he didn't say it in Origin of the Species, but that's not what was said in National Geographic. It said he never made that claim. And in The Descent of Man, on page 520, he says our ancestors would certainly be called apes. And that's very obviously what the evolutionists tell us. You've got Ernst Houghton, who was head of the anthropology department at Harvard, wrote the book Up from the Apes. He says if you descended from apes, somewhere in your family tree there squats an ape. That's exactly what they teach. But sometimes biology teachers will say, well, these folks that believe in creation don't know what they're talking about. We don't teach we came from apes. And it's just not true. It is it's what Darwin taught. It's what all the anthropologists teach. Now, we didn't come from a modern chimpanzee. They don't teach that. But what we did come from, the common ancestor that they point to, would, as Darwin acknowledged and the leading anthropologists say, would undoubtedly be called apes. Yes, they teach we came from apes, in spite of what National Geographic says. That's just an obvious falsehood. And, of course, when you look at these apes, again, you dig them up, they don't have signs stamped on them, say, I came from this one. They're just bones. And you have to line them up based on similarities. Well, you look at similarities, and you get led in all directions. You look at the platypus, for example, and he's got a duck bill, but he's not kin to the duck. He's got fur like a beaver, but he's not kin to the beaver. He injects venom with his fangs like reptiles and lays eggs like a reptile, but he's not a reptile. But he's kin to everybody. And the old adage is that which proves too much proves nothing. You look at the porpoise and the ichthyosaur, which is a reptile that looked like a porpoise or like a fish. Both the porpoise and the ichthyosaur look like fish, but they're not kin to the fish at all. You dig them up and you say, look, here's a bunch of fish, but you would be absolutely wrong. And so when the whole basis for the lineup, which is the evidence, is similarities which we know don't prove common kinship, then the whole basis is deceitful and not necessarily so at all. It could be misleading, and especially when you look at the apes that they line up. What's the basis for lining them up? Similarities. There was an interesting diagram that was published in Darwin's day that showed a pig that they gradually changed to get a little bulkier and a little shorter, and as it changed, it just gradually morphed over into a bull, and then continued to morph with the front of the legs getting a little bit longer, and finally wound up with a big pot-bellied man over here. And the morph is just a perfect continuum. That's not scientific. That's just what the person assumed and was illustrating. Of course, he was making fun of the same kind of supposedly scientific argument that proves what? It proves what the person assumes, and he lines it up according to that assumption, which isn't proof. And the similarities can often mislead.
So there's no real documentary or historical evidence for the general theory of evolution when it comes to fossils.
There is real documentary evidence, but I think it's negative to it. When you see all the major phyla represented at the lowest layers, when you see distinct and separate kinds all the way up the record with no transitional forms. Now, they'll try to say there are a few, like Archaeopteryx that we talked about before. I think he was a good bird. He's not a good transitional form. And when you look at their best example, they will say, well, there are fewer now than there were in Darwin's day because we've learned they're not good examples. And even those few don't work. And Darwin says there ought to be thousands. I think we have obvious documentary evidence, but it's negative to the evolution. I think it belongs to the creationists. There are over 250,000 species from the fossil record that are documented in museums today, and I think they're shouting creation. Sudden complex beginning, diverse from the start, more varieties at the beginning than we have now, distinct separate kinds ever since. What does that say? It doesn't say evolution. That says creation. And the only way you can make it say evolution is to ignore half of the evidence, many of the similarities, and then line them up according to the presumption, which is by no means proof.
Well, if there's so much negative evidence against evolution, why is it being taught in the public schools? How did it get there in the first place?
Because we allowed it. The naturalists are often more evangelistic than the Christians. Now, it's not that we're trying to teach religion, but I think we need all of the scientific evidence to have just good science. You can't constitutionally teach religion in the science classroom, but you can teach the strengths and weaknesses of evolution, and the Supreme Court has ruled on that and indicated that we can teach views alternative to evolution. The Edwards versus Willard case, Brennan wrote the majority opinion and says we already have the authority to do that. And sometimes school principals even don't understand that, and they say, no, it's illegal. Well, they just don't know what they're talking about. It's not so. No, you can't teach religion in the science classroom. And many people think that's what creation science is. Now, creation science is scientific evidence that would indicate either the sudden complex beginning or the gradual progressive continuum beginning. And that's looking at the empirical evidence. Some people have a real hard time comprehending how scientific evidence could indicate creation, but it's the kind of thing that we see all the time. For example, you go out and you see two rocks that you find laying in the road. One of them has a pointed end, and you see it branching out like a triangle, and then a notch at the other end, like an arrowhead. And then right beside it, you see it just an irregular shaped pebble. Now, you say, all right, this one was designed. This one happened by chance. Now, are you involved in a religious study there? You're distinguishing natural phenomenon from that which was intelligently designed. But that's not religion. That's examining the empirical evidence. And that you obviously can do and should do. And if you're just blind to it and just refuse the alternative of intelligent design, you're just ignoring evidence and implications that makes for poor science. You're beginning with the answer and making everything fit. You go to the beach, and you may see these lineations, these lines that were left by the tide. Okay, they're lined up there. That happened naturally? Yeah, probably so. But then you go a little further, and you see these markings in the sand. John loves Mary. Did the waves do that, or did somebody write in the sand? Well, you know this was intelligently designed because you've been to Sunday school class. No, I don't think so. Does that have to be in the Sunday school class, not in the science classroom? That's nonsense. But it's an empirical way to distinguish between intelligent design and what occurs naturally. Carl Sagan spent a great deal of effort and energy promoting the idea of the SETI program. You look up into the sky through the telescope, and you try to find intelligent design in outer space. What would indicate that? Well, these ... Just a few little irregular sounds or dashes or dots would prove intelligent design. And they've got thousands of computers out there trying to figure out this right now, reading what they see through the telescope. Well, just turn around and look down the microscope instead of up the telescope at the DNA. And according to Carl Sagan, you got information, the equivalent of 10 to the 12th bits. He says that's the equivalent of 100,000 pages in the Encyclopedia Britannica in the simplest cell with the nucleus, the DNA. That's a whole lot more than a few dots and dashes, but they don't see intelligent design there. A few dots and dashes up the telescope would indicate intelligent design. 100,000 pages in the Encyclopedia Britannica down the microscope, and they just ignore the implication. I think that's nonsense. I don't think it's religion. I think it's science, and we need all of the evidence in order to have good science.
One last question, and that is, what's the implication of evolution being taught in our schools? That here you have people who are excluding this evidence, fossil record and promoting evolution. What's the implication?
Well, that, of course, is not a scientific question. This is a philosophical question. But it is one that I think we need to think about. And I think you can look at the fruits of the tree, you might say, which is the way Jesus put it. By their fruits you shall know them. Historically, politically, we can see some very dire consequences. We see, for example, that Hitler was very dedicated to the concepts of Darwin. That's a direct product of his thinking. Mein Kampf, my struggle for survival. That came directly from Darwin. And he continually talked about his faith in the struggle for survival. And how do you make progress? Well, you kill off the weaker forms.
Survival of the fittest.
Yes. And the weaker forms he determined were Jews, and you kill them off, and now you enhance the survival value. You have a super race. And he had breeding programs, all based on the concepts of Darwin. Karl Marx wanted to dedicate his book, Das Kapital, to Darwin, which Darwin politely declined, but he acknowledged his indebtedness to Darwin in his thinking. And the way to make progress in the world is to kill off. Well, there's no denying, even as their biographers acknowledge, this is where their thinking came from. This is one of the fruits of the tree. I think we see very dire implications. If you tell kids that they're just extra smart animals, why should we be surprised when they act like animals? What's wrong with killing off a weaker form if you're an animal? This is what animals do. And so they begin to act that way. And we see Jeffrey Dahmer, for example, saying that's exactly where he got his philosophy. He was taught it in school. And when Stone Phillips interviewed him on NBC, he acknowledged that it came from his thinking of evolution. He was taught as a fact. And so he just came from slime. He was going back to slime. What difference did it make what he did? Did what he wanted to. The Columbine shooters were dedicated to Darwin and to evolution, and this was a part of their philosophy, which was seen in the things that they wrote. What are the fruits of the tree? What's being produced here? What are the implications? We've taught them they're extra smart animals, that they're just accidents, there's no purpose, it just naturally evolved, and so they act like things that just naturally evolved that have no obligation to a creator or have no basis for morality. Mm-hmm. It's been replaced by survival of the fittest and ethics based on might makes right. Mm-hmm. And the evidence is all around us. Yes, there are tremendous implications, and we need to be aware of it.
Mm-hmm. So comparing the two worldviews, you've got evolution, which excuses any immoral behavior, whereas if you believe in a creator, then you're obligated to answer to him, and he expects you to live and be the kind of person you ought to be.
You can't explain the sense of morality that we see embedded in virtually every human, even an atheist, apart from something besides the natural processes. The lion doesn't have that when he goes out and kills the antelope. This is something that is, I think, embedded by the Creator, our conscience, and it's obvious. And you misrepresent the atheistic evolutionist, and he'll say, you ought not to do that. Ought. That's an interesting word. Where did that come from? What's the why ought not? If it helps me win, why shouldn't I lie? You ought not to. Well, yes, I know that, and you know that, but how do we know that is the question. Right. I remember Michael Roos was a philosopher that was lecturing at SMU several years ago, and he was asked by one of the students there, you're an atheist, you don't believe in God, where did our sense of morality come from? And he said, well, it evolved from the herd instinct. She began to think about that, and she said, no, wait a minute. Here's the lion that evolves one sense of morality, evolving this sense of ferociousness and killing and ripping, and the same process produced the opposite effects. Now, that sounds like you can explain most anything with your philosophy. There's no way to test it. And he said, well, that's one of the mysteries of life. That's the best they can do. Philosophically, I think we see some very serious implications, and we see contradictions to what we observe in the behavior of people. Mm-hmm. It's not what would be produced by a naturalistic process. We have something more than that.
Mm-hmm. So the general decline in morality in society today is due to so many people now rejecting the view that God is a creator and that He's given us His will to follow.
We had immorality before there was evolution. But evolution certainly will have an impact negatively on a sense of morality and right and wrong. I think we can say not that it is responsible for all the immorality in the world, but it makes a lot of it respectable and intellectually acceptable to some, and it certainly has increased it by orders of magnitude.
That's certainly something that we should be concerned about.
I think so.
Mm-hmm. Well, I believe we're out of time for our program today, and I've enjoyed having you on the program here for these 3 weeks, and hope you can come back to this area soon.
Thank you, sir. I would love to.